My name is Cosima Vale. I'm 38 years old. For most of my adult life, I've been introduced as someone's wife before I've ever been introduced as myself. If you met me at a dinner party, you'd probably remember my posture before my voice. I sit straight. I listen fully. I don't interrupt. I've always believed that when you speak less, people reveal more. Most take that as softness. Some mistake it for passivity. My husband used to describe me as steady. His friends preferred sweet. My mother-in-law once called me easy to live with. They never meant it as an insult, but there's a particular kind of invisibility that happens when you are calm in a world that performs everything loudly. When you don't compete for volume, people assume you have nothing to say. When you don't react, they assume you don't see. I see everything. 10 years into my marriage, I believed I understood the man I had built my life with. I believed I understood the compromises, the rhythms, the silences. What I didn't realize was that while I was studying our life carefully, someone else was studying how much they could remove from it without me noticing. This story begins on our 10th wedding anniversary. It was supposed to be a celebration. Friends, family, candlelight, a speech about commitment and resilience. Instead, my husband chose that evening to introduce the woman he had been seeing behind my back. She was pregnant, and he brought her to my table, in front of everyone we loved. He believed the shock alone would silence me. He believed I would freeze in humiliation. He believed I would protect his image the way I always had. What he didn't know was that by the time dinner arrived, I had already been documenting something for months. Quietly, methodically, without anger, without confrontation. This is not a story about screaming in restaurants or throwing wine glasses. It is not about revenge. It is about observation. It is about patience. It is about understanding the difference between reacting and deciding. There is a particular power in allowing someone to underestimate you long enough to reveal exactly who they are. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. Not to embarrass him, not to glorify myself, but because there is a moment many of us face, the moment when we realize we have been cast in a role we never auditioned for. And the choice that follows that realization changes everything. Have you ever been so underestimated that people forgot you were watching? If you asked the people closest to me who I was before that anniversary dinner, they would have described me in relation to someone else. Daniel's wife. The organized one. The calm one. In rooms filled with entrepreneurs and investors, my husband shone the brightest. He was quick with humor, expansive with gestures, generous with praise when it served him. He loved an audience. I loved structure. The contrast looked romantic from the outside. Fire and still water. At least that's what people used to say. In Seattle's tech circles, Daniel was known as a visionary. I was known as supportive. At dinner parties, I refilled glasses before they emptied. I remembered allergies, birthdays, and small details about people's children. I sent handwritten thank you notes after events no one else considered significant. People would squeeze my arm and say, "He's so lucky to have you." What they meant was, "You make his life easier." And I did. Not because I was submissive, but because I believed partnership meant reinforcement. I handled contracts he didn't want to read. I corrected clauses in agreements he would have signed blindly. I flagged financial inconsistencies quietly, in private, so he could appear decisive in public. He often joked, "Cosima's the brains behind my chaos." Everyone laughed. I smiled. What no one noticed was that the joke slowly hardened into a role. At gatherings, Daniel told our origin story dramatically. How he trusted me, how I was hard to impress. It always ended with him saying, "She finally realized I was a good investment." A good investment. It sounded flattering, strategic, modern. But over time, I understood something subtle. In his mind, even love was transactional. I became a stable asset. The quiet equity, the reliable background presence increased his perceived value. When disagreements happened, he'd smooth them over publicly and address them later, privately, with a tone that suggested I was overthinking. "You're too sensitive to details," he would say. "Trust me. Trust me." Those two words are often spoken by people who benefit from you not asking more questions. Friends saw us as balanced. His spontaneity to my restraint, his ambition to my discernment. They never saw the small recalibrations I was making daily, adjusting my tone, shrinking a correction into a suggestion, editing my opinions so they sounded less like critique and more like curiosity. It wasn't fear, it was conditioning. When you're the calm one, People expect you to absorb impact without flinching. If he interrupted me mid-sentence, I would pause and let him finish. If he retold my story with embellishments, I let the inaccuracies slide. It felt minor, petty to correct. Over time, those small concessions accumulated. At our 9th anniversary dinner, a friend toasted Daniel's relentless drive and thanked me for keeping him grounded. Everyone applauded. No one asked what grounded me. I had become the emotional infrastructure of our marriage. Invisible, but load-bearing. And invisibility has a strange side effect. It allows you to observe without being observed back. They believed I was passive. They believed I didn't notice tone shifts, late nights that didn't align, messages he angled away from me, changes in scent, changes in language. But long before that 10th anniversary dinner, I had already begun writing things down in my black leather notebook. Dates, times, patterns. Not because I was jealous, because I was calibrating. You see, the role they assigned me was reliable. What they never considered was that reliability includes memory. And I remember everything. The first fracture in a marriage rarely sounds like breaking glass. It sounds like a joke. It was late autumn in Seattle, the kind of evening where the sky darkens before you're ready for it. Daniel had just closed a mid-level funding round. Nothing life-changing, but enough for him to want to celebrate. We were at a rooftop bar downtown with two couples we'd known for years. Laughter drifted easily between us. The heaters glowed amber. Everything looked warm. That's important, because the first cut happened in warmth. One of Daniel's friends, Mark, asked how we divided responsibilities at home. He was newly engaged, curious about how successful couples manage power. He meant it sincerely. I answered first. We don't really divide power, I said. We divide labor, and we revisit it when things shift. Daniel smiled beside me. But it was the tight kind, Mark laughed. So who makes the final call when you disagree? Before I could respond, Daniel placed his hand lightly on my shoulder. Oh, that's easy, he said. I do. Cosima likes to think she's the board of directors, but at the end of the day, I'm the CEO. Everyone chuckled. I did too. But something in me paused. It wasn't the joke itself. We'd teased each other before. It was the framing, the subtle repositioning. I had never described our marriage in hierarchical terms. Yet in one sentence, he had recast it publicly. CEO, board, authority. The metaphor lingered. I felt the shift not as humiliation, but as clarification. I watched the others absorb it. No one questioned it. It fit the image they already had. Daniel, the visionary. Me, the administrator. The conversation moved on. Drinks arrived. Music pulsed faintly from inside. But I began observing something new. Throughout the evening, Daniel spoke over me twice, corrected a detail about how we met, dismissed my suggestion about expanding into non-profit consulting with, "That's adorable, but not scalable." Adorable. A word you use for a child's drawing, not a strategy. When we drove home, the city lights blurred against the windshield. He was animated, replaying the night, pleased with himself. Mark needed that confidence boost, he said. Guys respect hierarchy. It's just how it works. I turned toward him slightly. Do you believe that's how we work? He hesitated, just long enough. I mean, someone has to lead. The sentence was calm, not aggressive, not defensive, but it carried an assumption. I could have pushed. I could have challenged the metaphor, asked why leadership required singularity instead of collaboration. Instead, I nodded slowly. Interesting, I could this in. That was the moment. Not the rooftop, not the joke. But the decision was not to argue. Because when someone casually defines your role in public, what they're revealing isn't dominance. It's a belief. Belief in a structure they assume you've already accepted. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't spiral. I didn't accuse him of disrespect. I opened my black leather notebook, and I wrote, October 14th. Public hierarchical framing. Language shift. CEO. Dismissal disguised as humor. Audience reinforcement is positive. It looked clinical on the page. It felt clarifying in my chest. The first small cut isn't meant to wound deeply. It's meant to test tolerance. Would I correct him next time? Would I demand equal language? Would I react? Or would I absorb? What he didn't understand is that silence is not the same as acceptance. Sometimes silence is data collection. And from that night forward, I began listening differently. After the rooftop comment, nothing dramatic happened. That's how normalization works. There was no confession, no lipstick on collars, no late-night arguments that shattered glass. There was only a gradual recalibration of tone, small enough to ignore, frequent enough to matter. Daniel began answering questions directed at me. At first, it was subtle. At a dinner with his investors, someone asked about compliance restructuring, my field. Before I could respond, he leaned forward. Cosima keeps me out of jail, he joked. She loves the fine print. Laughter. Approval. Another reframing. I added context after he finished, clarified the technicalities, but the hierarchy had already been established. I supported. He commanded. Later, I asked him gently why he answered for me. I was helping, he said. You take too long to get to the point. Too long. I have always chosen precision over speed, but I began noticing how often efficiency was used as a justification for override. If I paused to think, he filled the space. If I disagreed, he reframed it as nuance. If I suggested caution, he labeled it risk aversion. None of it sounded cruel. That was the brilliance of it. Disrespect that arrives softly rarely gets challenged loudly. And I, being calm, measured, reasonable, didn't want to appear reactive. So I adjusted. I tightened my responses, shortened my sentences, delivered ideas in bullet points so they couldn't be interrupted mid-structure. Still, he interrupted. It wasn't about time. It was about positioning. The first time he cancelled dinner plans without telling me, I rationalized it. He forgot, I told myself. He's overwhelmed. The second time, I received a text 30 minutes before guests were supposed to arrive. Rain check. Something came up. No explanation. When I called, he declined. When he returned home that night, he smelled different. Not perfume, just unfamiliar. You're being dramatic, he said when I mentioned it. It's a new co-working space. I nodded. Because technically, that could have been true. Normalization doesn't require proof. It only requires repetition. There were also compliments, strategically placed. You're the only one who really understands me. I don't know what I'd do without your stability. You're different from other women. The praise functioned like insulation. It softened the abrasion. Friends noticed nothing. In fact, they admired us more. You two never fight, one of my friends told me. I smiled. We didn't fight because conflict requires acknowledgement of friction. Daniel preferred dismissal, and I preferred observation. By month 3 of these subtle shifts, I realized something uncomfortable. I was beginning to anticipate being minimized. I would pre-edit my stories before telling them. I would prepare data to defend casual opinions. I would soften my tone before he even spoke. That is when disrespect becomes internalized. Not when someone speaks over you, but when you start shrinking in advance. One evening, while he showered, his phone lit up on the counter. I wasn't looking for it. It simply illuminated the dark. A name I didn't recognize, a message preview I couldn't fully see. I didn't touch the phone. Instead, I touched my notebook. Language shift is increasing. Schedule irregularities. Pattern of preemptive minimization observed in self. That last line surprised me. Observed in self, because by then, this was no longer just about what he was doing. It was about what I was tolerating. And tolerance, when unexamined, becomes permission. I wasn't angry. I was recalibrating, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And I had begun to understand something quietly devastating. The role I was assigned wasn't accidental. It was useful. There is a moment when you stop asking, why is he doing this? And start asking, why does this benefit him? That shift changes everything. By early spring, the pattern was no longer subtle to me. Daniel's tone in public had settled into something polished but proprietary. He introduced me less as a partner and more as a feature. This is my wife, Cosima. She keeps everything running. Running. As though I were an operating system. At charity galas, I handled seating adjustments while he networked. At investor retreats, I corrected paperwork quietly while he made keynote promises. When tension rose between him and his co-founder, I mediated over private dinners, absorbing volatility so his reputation stayed clean. People admired me for it. You're so grounded. You're so low drama. You're exactly what a man like him needs. What a man like him needs. No one asked what I needed. That's when I began to see the architecture of the role more clearly. Reliable, emotionally stable, non-threatening, loyal to the point of self-erasure. I wasn't being erased violently. I was being repurposed. And I had allowed it. Slowly, reasonably, diplomatically, because I believed harmony was evidence of maturity. One afternoon, I attended a strategy meeting at Daniel's office. I rarely went. I preferred working from my own consulting space. But he had asked for my opinion on a regulatory issue. During the meeting, I identified a compliance risk that could delay expansion by 6 months. The room went quiet. Daniel leaned back in his chair, smiling in that relaxed way he used when preparing to neutralize tension. Cosima always sees the storm clouds, he said lightly. But we're building rockets here. We can't wait for perfect weather. The team laughed. The metaphor again. He is the visionary. Me, the cautious backdrop, I responded calmly. Storm clouds aren't the problem. Uninsured rockets are. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Not because I was wrong, but because I had momentarily disrupted the script. After the meeting, he closed his office door. You embarrassed me, he said quietly. I answered the question you asked. You could have done it differently. Differently. That word lingered. Differently meant privately. Differently meant invisibly. Differently meant in a way that preserved his dominance narrative. That evening, I sat at our kitchen island and opened my notebook. For the first time, I didn't document his words. I documented the structure. Role assigned, stabilizer. Public diminishment framed as humor. Private correction when autonomy is shown. Value derived from emotional labor plus silence. It looked like a case study, because in many ways it was. I began replaying the past year through this new lens. The jokes, the interruptions, the praise, the subtle hierarchy, the late nights, the reframing of my caution as a limitation. It wasn't chaos. It was designed. And design implies intention. What unsettled me most wasn't the possibility of another woman. It was the possibility that he had already emotionally relocated me from partner to infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't get consulted. Infrastructure gets maintained. The realization didn't make me cry. It made me still. Because once you understand the role someone has assigned you, you face a quiet decision. Continue performing it. Or withdraw your compliance. That night, Daniel kissed my forehead before bed and thanked me for being so understanding. I smiled. And for the first time in 10 years, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not jealousy. Clarity. The kind that arrives when you recognize you've been cast in a play you never auditioned for. And I was done with supporting architecture in someone else's narrative. I just hadn't decided yet what I would build instead. The shift did not happen the day I saw a message on his phone. It did not happen after the investor meeting. It did not even happen after the word CEO. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March. I was alone in our kitchen. The house was quiet in that fragile way it only is before 7 a.m. Seattle rain tapped softly against the windows. Daniel had left early, another strategy breakfast. I no longer asked with whom. I was reviewing a compliance file for a client when an email notification appeared on my screen. It wasn't addressed to me. It was forwarded automatically from our shared household account, the one connected to property taxes and utility payments. Daniel rarely checked it. I did. The subject line was mundane, insurance policy update. Normally, I would have archived it without thought. But something in the policyholder details caught my eye. There was an additional beneficiary listed, not a name I recognized. Not a relative, not a business entity, a woman. My first reaction was not shock. It was stillness. I opened the document carefully, as though it might explode if mishandled. The policy had been amended 2 months earlier. A secondary life insurance beneficiary had been added at 25%. Not enough to be obvious, enough to matter. My pulse did not spike, my hands did not shake. Instead, my breathing slowed, because this was no longer tonal, no longer metaphorical, no longer interpretive. This was administrative. Paperwork is truth in its most unromantic form. I did not confront him. I did not call the insurance company immediately. I opened my notebook. March 8th. Insurance amendment. Secondary beneficiary added. 25%. Timeline aligns with increased schedule irregularity. Then I sat back in my chair, and I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for months. If I remove emotion, what remains? What remained was evidence of reallocation. Attention reallocated, time reallocated, now protection reallocated. The role I had been assigned, stable, silent, infrastructure, had expanded. I was not only supporting the structure, I was financing its evolution. That morning, I brewed coffee and drank it slowly. The rain continued. Nothing in the house looked different. But internally, something irreversible had occurred. I was no longer observing to understand him. I was observing to understand my position. There is a difference. Understanding him required empathy. Understanding my position required a strategy. By noon, I had requested a copy of the full policy history under the pretense of reviewing our financial portfolio. By evening, I had accessed our joint account logs going back 6 months. I did not dig frantically. I moved carefully. Because the moment you act from hurt, you reveal yourself. and I was not ready to reveal anything. When Daniel came home that night, he was animated again. He kissed my cheek, told me about an expansion idea, asked if I'd looked into a tax bracket adjustment. I listened, and for the first time in 10 years, I heard him as though he were a case study. Not my husband, a subject. His gestures, his pacing, his eye contact. He did not suspect a thing, because the version of me he understood, the calm one, the reasonable one, the woman who prioritized harmony, was still performing flawlessly. But internally, the axis had tilted. I no longer felt invisible. I felt informed. And information is leverage, even before it becomes action. That Tuesday morning did not bring tears. It brought orientation. I knew then that whatever this was, affair, entanglement, misjudgment, it had crossed from emotional betrayal into structural risk. And structural risk is something I am professionally trained to manage. I went to bed that night beside him, aware of the space between our bodies in a way I never had before. Not distance. Calculation. Something had shifted. Not in him, in me. After the insurance document, silence was no longer instinct. It was a strategy. There is a kind of quiet that comes from avoidance. And there is a kind of quiet that comes from preparation. I had lived in the first for months. Now I stepped into the second. Daniel continued exactly as he had. Late meetings, polished stories, affectionate gestures calibrated just enough to prevent suspicion. If anything, he seemed more relaxed, more certain of his footing. Confidence thrives in unchecked territory. He believed I occupied no such territory. I began to adjust in small, invisible ways. I restructured my consulting schedule, freeing certain afternoons. I scheduled a private consultation with a financial advisor, framed as portfolio optimization. I requested digital copies of our joint investments for tax review. He didn't question it. He trusted my competence. That was the irony. The very skills that made me valuable to him, organization, discretion, thoroughness, were now the same skills that allowed me to move without detection. Silence, when misunderstood, becomes camouflage. At dinner parties, I laughed at the right moments. I asked thoughtful questions. I refilled wine glasses. But I no longer absorbed the interruption. If he cut across my sentence, I paused deliberately and finished it anyway. Calmly. Not louder, just complete. People noticed subtly. So did he. Later that night, he said, "You've been different lately." Different how? I asked. Sharper. I held his gaze evenly. I've always been sharp. He smiled, as though it were flirtation. He did not understand it was confirmation. The messages on his phone became less hidden. Not because he was careful, but because he was comfortable. The confidence of someone who believes narrative control equals control itself. I never checked his phone directly. Instead, I tracked behavior. He had begun traveling overnight without prior calendar entries. Expenses appeared in neighborhoods outside his usual circuit. A second credit card, opened months ago, carried restaurant charges for two. Patterns form quickly when you stop debating your instincts. One evening, while he showered, I stood in our bedroom and looked at the framed photographs lining the dresser. Vacations, holidays, our wedding day. We looked like a partnership, but photographs freeze performance, not reality. I realized then that my silence had protected him long enough. Now it would protect me. I consulted an attorney, not to file anything yet, but to understand options, quietly, confidentially. I asked about asset division laws in Washington state, about life insurance beneficiaries, about business equity entanglements in marital dissolution. I did not mention an affair. I spoke in hypotheticals. Hypotheticals are safe. When I left that office, the sky was clear in a way Seattle rarely permits. The air felt thinner. I wasn't angry. I wasn't heartbroken in the cinematic sense. I felt organized. That may sound cold. It wasn't. It was self-preservation emerging after years of self-editing. Daniel mistook my continued composure for acceptance. If anything, he seemed emboldened by it. His absences stretched longer. His phone calls moved outside. Once, I caught the faint sound of laughter, light, feminine, unguarded, through a closed patio door. I didn't confront him. I wrote it down. Tone change? Buoyant. Risk tolerance is increasing. Perception of immunity high. Silence had become a choice. And choices accumulate into momentum. The more he assumed I was unaware, the more freedom he gave himself. The more freedom he took, the clearer his pattern became. And clarity is a powerful thing, because once you stop arguing with reality, you can begin designing your response to it. I wasn't gathering evidence for revenge. I was gathering orientation for inevitability. He thought I was being patient. He didn't realize I was being precise. There is something people misunderstand about quiet women. They assume we are enduring. They rarely consider that we are building. By the time Daniel grew comfortable enough to leave his phone face up on the kitchen counter, I no longer needed to look at it. The pattern had already taken shape in my notebook, like a constellation. Dates aligned with expense reports, travel aligned with calendar gaps, policy changes aligned with emotional distance. But documentation was only the surface. Preparation is rarely dramatic. It is administrative. It happens in office waiting rooms, through encrypted emails, in meetings labeled portfolio review. I began with assets. Washington State is a community property state. That matters. It means what was built during the marriage is shared, regardless of whose name headlines the press releases. Daniel's company had grown substantially in the past 4 years. What most people didn't know was that I had reviewed the original compliance structure. I had quietly advised on the legal framework that protected him from early liability exposure. My fingerprints were on the architecture. I requested updated evaluations for insurance recalibration. That language raised no alarms. Entrepreneurs love recalibration. Next, I met with a forensic accountant under the guise of due diligence for a client. I asked broad questions about asset shielding, hidden liabilities, and off-ledger spending patterns. I listened more than I spoke. Patterns that appear romantic in one context look fraudulent in another. And while I had no evidence of financial crime, I had increasing evidence of financial redirection. Then came the health insurance audit. It was simple, routine, responsible, except it revealed an additional recurring payment tied to a private obstetrics clinic across town. I did not gasp. I noted. Clinic billing cycle, 4 weeks. Cross-reference with travel pattern. I already suspected pregnancy before I confirmed it. There's a particular way a man carries secrecy when it's no longer about flirtation, but consequence. He becomes protective, not... I didn't search her name immediately. When I finally did, it was with the same restraint I use when reviewing compliance breaches. No emotional projection, just fact-finding. She was younger, late 20s, marketing consultant. No social media posts referencing Daniel directly, but there were subtle overlaps, conference check-ins, location tags, mutual connections in tech. They weren't reckless. They were confident. Confidence leaves trails. What Daniel never noticed was that my demeanor had grown even softer in public. I hosted more dinners, sent more invitations, reconnected with extended family, strengthened friendships. Not performatively, strategically, because if a narrative was going to fracture, I wanted witnesses to remember consistency, not hysteria. I also adjusted our legal documents, updated my will, reassigned my power of attorney, separated certain personal investments into a trust. All perfectly legal, all documented. He signed a few of the updates himself, barely reading them. He trusted me. Trust is an extraordinary vulnerability when misplaced. There were nights I lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing, aware that I was no longer grieving the possibility of betrayal. I was mapping the perimeter of it. The clinic confirmation arrived 3 weeks before our anniversary dinner. A routine insurance claim summary. Estimated due date, late summer. The timing aligned precisely with when the secondary beneficiary had been added. That was when the story stopped being abstract. She wasn't just an affair. She was an investment. And investments imply intention. I did not cry. I closed the document. And I realized something essential. He believed he was managing 2 futures. What he never noticed was that I had begun securing mine. The dinners, the notes, the legal consultations, the financial reviews. None of it was impulsive. All of it was positioning. By the time he decided to bring her into public view, he thought he was controlling the narrative. He didn't understand that narratives can only be controlled when no one else has documentation. And I had been documenting for months. The confirmation did not arrive in a dramatic envelope. It arrived as a PDF, clinical, itemized, undeniable. I was sitting at my desk when the final insurance summary populated in our shared portal. I had already seen the recurring clinic payments. I had already aligned the billing cycle with his unexplained trips, but this document was different. It listed the primary patient, her full name, and under insured partner, it listed Daniel. Not spouse, partner. The language was subtle, but official. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I was shocked, but because I was absorbing the precision of it. The paperwork made something painfully clear. This was not a careless affair spiraling out of control. It was structured. She had access to his insurance. He had claimed her as dependent adjacent. The child was expected in late August. Our anniversary was in May. The timeline wasn't just betrayal. It was an overlap. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. There are moments when your body expects tears, because that is what films have taught us. But what I felt instead was clarity settling into place like the final piece of a puzzle. For months, I had been building a file. Expenses, policy changes, communication patterns, travel logs. Now I had the axis. Pregnancy changes risk calculus. It shifts affairs from secrecy to inevitability. He could not keep her hidden indefinitely. Not with a child involved. At some point, disclosure or exposure would become necessary. The question was timing. And who would control it? I did not confront him that night. Instead, I made copies, encrypted digital files, printed records stored off-site. I met with my attorney again, this time with documentation. I still spoke calmly. I want to understand my leverage, I said. He studied the papers carefully. You have more than you think, he replied. We discussed asset division scenarios, custodial implications if a child were publicly acknowledged, the reputational risk to his company if investors perceived instability, not revenge, risk assessment. I left that meeting feeling lighter than I expected, because leverage does something powerful. It replaces panic with options. At home, Daniel kissed me in the kitchen while stirring pasta sauce. He looked relaxed, almost affectionate in a nostalgic way. Hard week? He asked. Productive, I said. And I meant it. The private reveal wasn't about discovering he loved someone else. I had already suspected that. It wasn't about the pregnancy itself. It was about realizing that he believed he could integrate this new life without dismantling the old one. He thought I would remain infrastructure, absorb the shock, protect the brand, accept a rearranged hierarchy, perhaps even negotiate quietly. What he underestimated was this. I was not afraid of collapse. I was afraid of self-betrayal. And by then I had already chosen not to betray myself again. Over the next few weeks, I moved carefully. I finalized my financial separation strategy, redirected my consulting contracts into an independent LLC solely under my name, adjusted automatic transfers. Nothing aggressive, nothing loud, just alignment. The anniversary invitations had already been sent. Family, close friends, business associates. He insisted on making it memorable, a celebration of endurance. I agreed, because by then, I understood something he didn't. Public gestures are dangerous when private documentation exists. And if he was going to introduce a new narrative into our shared life, I would be prepared to reveal the full context. Not with fury, not with a spectacle, but with fact. There is a quiet moment before a life changes when everything is still technically intact. The house is standing, the invitations are sent, the marriage is legally active. From the outside, nothing has collapsed. Inside, the decision has already been made. 3 weeks before our anniversary dinner, Daniel mentioned that he wanted the evening to feel honest. That was the word he used. Honest. He stood at the kitchen island, swirling a glass of wine, not quite meeting my eyes. I've been thinking, he said. I don't want to live in compartments anymore. Compartments. I watched him carefully. His shoulders were relaxed, not guilty, resolved. I agree, I said evenly. Compartmentalization is exhausting. He exhaled, relieved by what he interpreted as understanding. I think it's time everyone sees the full picture, he continued. The business is growing. My life is expanding. I don't want secrets. My life is expanding. I didn't ask him to clarify. He believed he was initiating disclosure from a place of courage. He believed that if he framed it as authenticity, he could bypass the brutality of betrayal. He did not yet know what I knew. He assumed I would resist privately but preserve him publicly. That was the version of me he understood. That evening, after he went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The lights were dim. The invitations for our anniversary dinner lay stacked on the console table. Gold lettering, embossed edges, carefully curated guest list. I asked myself the question that had been hovering for weeks. What do I want? Not what is fair, not what is strategic, not what punishes him. What do I want? There were multiple options available to me. I could confront him before the dinner, force a private reckoning, negotiate quietly, restructure the marriage under terms. I could file for divorce immediately and cancel the event, protect myself from public spectacle. I could say nothing at all and let him reveal whatever version of truth he intended, then respond later. Each option carried a consequence, but only one aligned with something deeper than reaction. I did not want revenge. I wanted narrative control. If he intended to integrate his pregnant mistress into our shared social world on the night meant to celebrate our decade of marriage, then that was not just a confession. It was a theatre. And if there was going to be a theatre, I would not be cast as the silent casualty. The decision crystallized quietly. I would let the dinner proceed. I would let him speak. And when the moment arrived, I would respond, not emotionally, not explosively, but with documentation. Not to humiliate him, to correct the record. Because there is something deeply destabilizing about facts delivered calmly in a room expecting chaos. I gathered my files and placed copies into a slim folder. Insurance amendments, financial transfers, clinic billing cycles, beneficiary changes. I rehearsed nothing. Truth requires no script. The next morning, Daniel asked if I was excited for the dinner. "I'm prepared," I replied. He smiled, interpreting the word differently than I intended. The decision point was not about whether I would leave. It was about whether I would allow him to define the story first. And for the first time in our marriage, I chose not to. Not in anger, in authorship. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. The anniversary dinner was scheduled for a Saturday evening in May at a private room in one of Seattle's waterfront restaurants. 50 guests, close friends, immediate family. A few investors had watched Daniel's company grow from concept to scale. He wanted symbolism. I prepared the structure. The week before the dinner, I finalized 3 things. First, my financial separation. My consulting income had always been deposited into our joint account by habit, not necessity. I redirected new contracts into my independent LLC, quietly, legally. My accountant filed the paperwork. Automatic transfers were paused under the pretense of cash flow optimization. Daniel didn't notice. He rarely reviewed the details I managed competently. Second, documentation security. Digital copies of everything were stored in encrypted cloud folders, accessible only to my attorney and me. Physical copies were placed in a sealed envelope inside a safety deposit box I had opened 2 months earlier. Redundancy is stability. Third, legal timing. My attorney drafted preliminary divorce paperwork, but held the filing. In Washington state, timing matters, especially when children outside the marriage are involved. We discussed optics. We discussed leverage. We discussed settlement structures that would prevent prolonged litigation. Nothing was filed yet, but everything was ready. That is the power of moving in silence. By the time anyone sees motion, the outcome is already aligned. At home, Daniel was energized. He ordered a custom cake with gold script reading 10 years strong. He rehearsed what he called a transparent toast. "I want it to feel mature," he said one night while adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror. "Progressive, like we've evolved beyond traditional expectations." Traditional expectations! He framed betrayal as evolution. I studied his reflection in the mirror behind him. "Clarity is always refreshing," I said. He smiled, misreading me again. On Thursday evening, I confirmed the guest list personally. I made sure the seating arrangement placed both our families near the front. Investors along the side, close friends central. Visibility matters. If a truth is going to enter a room, witnesses shape its impact. I chose my dress deliberately. Not to compete, not to provoke. A structured ivory gown, simple and architectural, calm, unapologetic. No one dresses accidentally on the night their life changes. The day before the dinner, I met with my attorney one final time. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Yes. Once it's public, it cannot be contained." "I know." He paused. "Then remain calm." "I intend to." That evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He seemed almost sentimental. He opened a bottle of wine we had saved from our 5th anniversary and spoke about growth, resilience, and the complexity of modern relationships. He was preparing himself to be admired for honesty. I listened without interruption. Silence unsettles people more than an accusation. Later, lying beside him in bed, I felt something unexpected. Not rage, not heartbreak. Completion. The preparation phase was over. What remained was execution. Not in a violent sense, but in a precise one. He believed he was walking into a celebration that would redefine him as brave. He didn't understand that the room would not be shaped by his speech. It would be shaped by documentation, and I would deliver it without raising my voice. The anniversary dinner began exactly as planned. Soft candlelight, polished glassware, a string quartet playing something understated and nostalgic. The private room overlooked the dark water, city lights reflecting in long, trembling lines. People hugged me first. They always did. You look radiant. 10 years, what an accomplishment. You two are proof it can work. I smiled gently, thanked them, guided them to their seats. Daniel was magnetic that night. Confident, warm, moving from table to table with the ease of someone about to unveil something he believes will redefine him as courageous. The cake was placed near the center, 10 years strong. I noted the irony without bitterness. Dinner progressed smoothly. Toasts were offered, friends recounting early struggles, my sister speaking about loyalty, one of Daniel's investors praising his vision anchored by stability. Anchored. Again, I was infrastructure in their language. Then Daniel stood. He tapped his glass lightly. The room softened into anticipation. I've been thinking a lot about honesty, he began. His voice carried effortlessly. He spoke about growth, about refusing to live compartmentalized lives, about authenticity in a changing world. A few guests shifted in their seats, curious where this was going. Then he gestured toward the doorway, and she walked in. Young, composed. Her dress was modest but unmistakably outlined her pregnancy. A collective intake of breath filled the room. Not loud, but synchronized. This, Daniel said carefully, is someone important in my life, and we're expecting a child. Silence. Thick, electric. All eyes turned to me. This was the moment he had calculated. The shock, the spectacle, the assumption that I would either crumble or perform dignified devastation. Instead, I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my plate. I stood. My movements were unhurried. The room expected tears, or fury, or collapse. I offered none. Thank you for your honesty, Daniel, I said calmly. My voice did not tremble. I agree that compartments can't last forever. He blinked, uncertain. I turned to the guests. Not dramatically, not theatrically, simply present. For those of you who weren't aware, I continued, Daniel amended his life insurance policy 2 months ago to include a secondary beneficiary. He's also been covering obstetric expenses through our joint accounts. A ripple moved through the room, confusion shifting into comprehension. I reached into my evening clutch and removed a slim folder. I've been documenting financial and legal changes for months, not because I suspected evolution, I said evenly, but because I noticed reallocation. Daniel's expression changed, not into anger, but into something rarer. Unpreparedness. I did not wave papers in the air. I did not raise my voice. I won't discuss personal details further tonight, I added. But I will clarify this. Nothing here is spontaneous. The pregnancy aligns precisely with documented policy changes. The room was no longer focused on scandal. It was focused on sequence. That is the power of calm documentation. It shifts the narrative from emotion to accountability. Daniel attempted a smile. Asima, this isn't the time. It is exactly the time, I replied gently. You chose the stage. Silence again. Not hostile. Measured. Then I sat down. No screaming, no tears, no spectacle. Just facts are introduced into a room, expecting performance. And something subtle began to happen. Not applause, not confrontation. Distance. His investors avoided eye contact. My sister's hand found mine under the table. One of Daniel's closest friends looked at him, not in admiration, but in assessment. Consequences rarely explode. They unfold. And in that moment, Daniel realized something he had not anticipated. Shock can command attention, but documentation commands credibility. The dinner did not end with shouting. It ended with quiet dispersal. Conversations resumed in fragments. Soft, confused, polite. People hugged me with a new kind of caution, as though I had shifted from background to axis without warning. Daniel attempted to salvage the tone. He spoke in low voices near the bar, explaining that life was complex, that adults could evolve beyond traditional boundaries. He framed himself as transparent, progressive, misunderstood. But something had already moved beyond his reach. It wasn't outrage. It was a recalculation. Investors left earlier than planned. One of them avoided Daniel entirely on the way out. A longtime friend of his shook my hand with deliberate firmness and said, "Call me if you need anything." Need. For the first time that evening, the word applied to me. The pregnant woman, her name was Lila, I later learned, remained near the doorway, uncertain. She hadn't expected documentation. She hadn't expected the room to pivot. I did not approach her. She wasn't my adversary. She was a variable. When the last guest departed, the staff cleared plates in careful silence. The cake, untouched, was boxed and removed. 10 years strong. The phrase felt archaeological. Daniel turned to me once we were alone in the room. You blindsided me, he said quietly. I studied him. You scheduled the stage, I replied. I was trying to be honest. You were trying to be admired. The words were not sharp, just accurate. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I had seen 100 times when negotiations went wrong. This didn't have to happen like this. No, I agreed. It didn't. That was the truth. There had been dozens of off-ramps before this evening, conversations he could have initiated privately, decisions he could have made without spectacle. But spectacle had been part of his calculation. He assumed my composure equaled compliance. What he hadn't accounted for was documentation. On the drive home, he oscillated between defense and appeal. We can work through this. It doesn't have to be a divorce. You've always been rational. Rational. He said it like a compliment. It sounded like an expectation. When we pulled into the driveway, I turned to him. I filed preliminary paperwork last week, I said calmly. It will be submitted on Monday. His face stilled completely. You're serious? I've been serious for months. There was no dramatic pause, no raised voices, just the quiet understanding that timing had run out. Inside the house, he paced while I removed my earrings. He spoke about reputation, about complexity, about the child needing stability. I listened. Then I said something that finally penetrated. Stability isn't silence. He stopped moving. For the first time since the rooftop joke months ago, I saw uncertainty fully surface in him. Not because he was losing me emotionally, but because he was losing control of the narrative. You're overreacting, he said finally. I reacted months ago, I replied. Tonight was execution. The word landed heavily, not violent, not cruel, just final. He slept in the guest room that night. Not because I asked him to, because something had already separated. By morning, messages were arriving from guests. Some care, some direct, all recalibrated. The story he intended to tell had shifted, and once credibility fractures in public, it cannot be privately restored. It was too late to fix. Not because of anger, because of the sequence. The confrontation did not happen in the restaurant. It happened 2 mornings later, at our kitchen table. The house felt unfamiliar in daylight. Not hostile, just rearranged. Daniel had not gone to the office. His phone vibrated intermittently with messages he wasn't answering. I poured coffee for both of us out of habit. Some gestures outlive emotion. He looked tired. Not devastated, not ashamed. Tired of the way someone looks when a strategy collapses unexpectedly. We need to talk, he said. We do, I agreed. There was no raised voice, no trembling hands, just 2 adults seated across from one another, the history of 10 years between them like a third presence. I never meant to humiliate you, he began. I know, I replied. He blinked, thrown off by the lack of resistance. I thought if I presented it openly, it would feel progressive, honest. I didn't want secrecy anymore. You didn't want secrecy, I said calmly. You wanted admiration for disclosure. His jaw tightened slightly. That's not fair. It's accurate. Silence settled, but it wasn't volatile. It was evaluative. I didn't think you'd go that far, he admitted. The documentation, the paperwork. That's the part that surprises you, I asked gently. Not the pregnancy, not the insurance change, the documentation. He looked down at the table. I thought you'd fight me privately, or negotiate. Negotiate. The word hung between us. Negotiate what? I asked. My position? He didn't answer, because we both knew that was precisely what he had anticipated. A quiet restructuring, a dignified compromise, perhaps even an arrangement that preserved optics. You underestimated me, I said, not accusing, observing. He exhaled. You were always the steady one. Steady doesn't mean static. That was the first time his eyes lifted fully to meet mine. There it was, the realization. Not that I was angry, not that I was irrational, but I had moved without asking his permission. I didn't think you'd leave. He said, if you get he said. I didn't either, I admitted. And that was the most honest sentence of the morning. I hadn't planned to become a woman who ends a decade-long marriage over betrayal. I had planned to be a partner, a collaborator, a co-architect. But partnership requires mutual authorship. You had months, I continued quietly. You could have told me before the paperwork changed, before policies shifted, before you built a second life parallel to ours. He rubbed his temples. I didn't know how. You didn't want to risk losing control. That landed, because control had always been his currency. This isn't about punishment, I added. It's about alignment. You made long-term decisions without my consent. I responded with long-term decisions of my own. He studied me as if seeing a new dimension. You're cold, he said finally. No, I replied softly. I'm clear. There was a difference. We discussed logistics after that. House valuation, timelines, public statements, practicalities. The tone remained even, almost businesslike. At one point he asked, "Do you hate me?" I considered the question honestly. No, I said. I hate who I was becoming. That silenced him more than an accusation would have. The confrontation ended not with slammed doors, but with signatures scheduled and calendars adjusted. The heat would have burned quickly. Clarity endures. It has been 11 months since that anniversary dinner. The divorce was finalized in late winter, quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. The settlement reflected documentation, not drama. My consulting firm now operates under my sole name. I kept the house. He kept his company. The equity division was precise. People often ask if I regret doing it publicly. I don't, because what looked public was actually procedural. The exposure wasn't emotional, it was factual. He chose the stage. I chose to correct the script. Daniel is now fully integrated into the life he introduced that night. I've heard the baby was born healthy. I hope that is true. Children deserve stability that adults sometimes fail to model. I don't feel bitterness toward her, or toward him, in the way people expect. What I feel is distance from the version of myself who believed calm meant accommodation. For years, I confused composure with self-sacrifice. I believed that if I remained steady enough, reasonable enough, patient enough, everything could be recalibrated without rupture. But there is a quiet violence in tolerating erosion, and I will never participate in that again. Who I am now is not louder, not sharper, not hardened. I am simply unedited. In meetings, I speak fully without compressing my thoughts into something more palatable. If someone interrupts, I continue, not aggressively, just completely. In relationships, professional and personal, I ask direct questions sooner. I do not wait for patterns to crystallize before acknowledging them. Most importantly, I no longer accept roles assigned without my consent. Reliability is still part of me. Calm is still part of me. But neither will be mistaken for passive again. The black leather notebook still exists. I carry it less now, not because I distrust less, but because I trust myself more. Documentation is powerful, but discernment is stronger when it doesn't need proof to validate instinct. Sometimes I replay that dinner in my mind, not the moment he introduced her, but the moment I stood. There was no shaking, no surge of adrenaline, just alignment. And that alignment has become my standard. People who once described me as easy to live with now describe me differently. Grounded, decisive, clear. The difference is subtle. Grounded implies presence. Clear implies boundaries. I didn't become someone new. I removed what was diminishing me. There is an elegance in leaving without chaos, in speaking without shouting, in closing a door without slamming it. That elegance is not weakness. It is sovereignty. And sovereignty, once reclaimed, does not ask permission to remain. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. Silence is not submission. But it can become self-abandonment if you never examine why you're quiet. For years, I believed my restraint made me mature. I believed my patience made me strong, and in many ways, it did. Calm is a discipline. Observation is a skill. Emotional regulation is power. But power without boundaries becomes permission. What happened at that anniversary dinner was not revenge. It was not humiliation. It was not theatrical destruction. It was alignment catching up with deception. Daniel underestimated me because I did not perform dominance. I did not threaten. I did not compete for volume. He mistook my steadiness for dependency, and I allowed that misinterpretation longer than I should have. The real turning point in my story wasn't the pregnancy. It wasn't the public reveal. It was the moment I stopped asking, "How do I preserve this?" and started asking, "Does this preserve me?" There is a difference. When someone introduces chaos into your life, Your first instinct might be to contain it quietly, to protect appearances, to protect history, to protect the version of yourself that once believed everything was mutual. But preservation at the cost of self-respect is not maturity. It is erosion. Documentation gave me leverage, calm gave me credibility, but clarity gave me freedom. You don't have to shout to change your life. You don't have to destroy someone to disengage from them. You don't have to become cruel to stop being compliant. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone reveal who they are, fully, then respond with the truth, evenly delivered. No spectacle, no rage, just a fact, and then you move. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever felt yourself shrinking in a role you didn't choose, if you've ever stayed quiet longer than you should have, I want to ask you something. At what point does patience stop being strength and start becoming self-betrayal? Tell me your thoughts in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.